My name is Charles Berlin, and I'm the head of the Judaica Division of the Harvard Library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Jacob Pat Memorial Lecture, co-sponsored by the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies. The Pat Memorial Lecture is a project of the Jacob and Frida Pat Endowment in the Harvard College Library and the Abraham and Rachel Bornstein Fund in the Center for Jewish Studies. The Jacob and Frida Pat Endowment in the library is one of our major resources for the acquisition of Yiddish materials. As you know, Harvard has an extraordinary Yiddish collection, and the Pat Endowment is one of our significant resources. The endowment makes possible our acquisitions of Yiddish, along with other endowments, and it also makes possible this annual Jacob Pat Memorial Lecture. It was established by his widow Frida Pat in 1979, and in memory of her husband Jacob Pat, who many of you know was a leader in Jewish education in Poland before he came to the United States. And in the States, he was the executive secretary of the Jewish Labor Committee, and also a prolific Yiddish writer. Our speaker today, Saul Noam Zaret, is an assistant professor of Yiddish literature in the departments of comparative literature and Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Harvard. He received an MA in Hebrew literature from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a PhD in Jewish literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He has been a fellow at Washington University in St. Louis and at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. His research has been published in such journals as Proof Text, Studies in American Jewish Literature, and American Literary History, and focuses on the convergence of modern Jewish literatures and the global literary market. He is also the former editor-in-chief of InGeveb, an online journal of Yiddish studies. And for your information, we are video recording today's lecture, and we hope to put it online on the InGeveb website and online at Harvard also, so that you may have the pleasure of listening to it again, and those of your friends who were unable to be here can hear the lecture at their convenience. Professor Zaret.
Excuse me, Charles. Took my paper. No worries. Hi, welcome. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for this kind introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks to the Judaic Division, to the Center for Jewish Studies, and for making this talk possible. So, I'm just going to get right into it. We're going to start with a bit of philology. It may be a bit dry, but stick with me. I think it's worth it. So the Hebrew word for the world, olam, is found in the Bible rarely, if ever, actually means the physical world. It almost exclusively denotes the very fact of existence, both human and divine, transcendent and mundane, future and past. So, for instance, the phrase Brit Olam means a divine covenant that exists for all time. Or Mete Olam means the dead that have, those who are long dead, right? Mete meaning the dead, and Olam meaning forever, or for a very long time. So Olam designates a sense of continuity and perpetuity, referring alternately to the enduring presence of the divine or the irrevocable absence of the dead. The term only takes on the more widely known and perhaps more modern meaning of the physical world in post-biblical literature, predominantly in rabbinic discourse. So there's a kind of uneasy convergence between an early metaphysical meaning of the word, and a new material, almost planetary definition, which produces this conflation of time and space, to live in this world, ba'olam hazeh, in a concrete or even profane world of experience, and to strive to gain entrance into the olam haba, right, the world to come, that world of ultimate transcendence. So in Jewish tradition, as it emerges from biblical sources and rabbinic practice, a person exists under the demands of two opposing yet complementary worlds, right? Human and divine, transient and eternal, circumscribed and boundless. So these definitions of olam and their internal contradictions run parallel to the Germanic Welt, which has a similar etymological history. Welt also began as a temporal designation. It literally means the age of humanity, coming from the Latin vir and the Germanic alt, meaning the age of man. But over time, of course, this temporal designation also gave way to a spatial sense of the world, meaning that space in which humanity exists, right, in which man exists. In this way, Welt too is doubled in a certain way, as a confluence of time and space. And as we know, German has a particular presence in Yiddish, right? Yiddish is a Germanic language with Hebraic and other components mixed in. Jews of Germanic lands, as they moved east, they incorporated other linguistic structures from Roman languages, Slavic languages, and so on top of a German-Hebrew fusion. And so Welt, in all of its meanings, is perfectly at home in Yiddish. It's a perfectly normal Yiddish word. But of course, when we get two different words into Yiddish from two different language components, they often overlap in strange ways. They don't actually always mean exactly the same thing. So Yiddish has olam in addition to Welt. And what happens is that also olam, when it occurs in Yiddish, takes on another meaning, as pronounced in Yiddish as oilam. So, in Yiddish, designations of time and place, profane and sacred, are populated by something called an oilam, meaning an audience. This is similar to something in French, right? Tout le monde. So oilam means that world that immediately surrounds you. You all right now, of course, are my oilam for the next 30 minutes or so. We have this space that means the world, but the world is limited to those people around you, not necessarily some cosmological sense of it, but us right here. So we have olam as a designation of human and messianic time, olam as a designation of physical space, and then oilam as a way to name the people sitting there in front of you. So if you take into account all these definitions of the world in Hebrew, German, and Yiddish, and attempt to understand them in relation to this nebulous term world literature, or Weltliteratur, one faces a linguistic irony that is as devastating as it is encouraging. The world of world literature is only as big as a text's audience, as big as its oilam. So the mere existence of this world depends on how long such an audience endures in some way, if at all. World literature, at least for Jewish languages, cannot simply mean all the world's literatures of all time. Rather, what this initial etymological investigation reveals is that world literature is more often a limited set of texts, read by a particular oilam in a particular time and place. Though with an always present messianic transcendental horizon, right, we might sometime arrive in a world literature that encompasses everything. Now, one outcome of this revelation is that in trying to understand the place of a work of world literature, or place a work of any literature in the world, one inevitably must contend with the very instability of the world as a concept. We must take into account a multitude of different publics, global and local, national and international, that consume a text as well as multiple temporalities in which a text lives and moves. for modern Jewish writers who want to enter the conversation of world literature, to enter onto this world stage, there's a constant struggle to determine in what worlds, in whose worlds their writing actually belongs. And this struggle is built in the very vocabularies that Jewish writers use to even think of the world. In writing literature of the world, planet, earth, Welt, Mond, Cosmos, Mir, Svat, Olam, Oilam, modern Jewish writers must face the challenge of how their multiple audiences interrelate and overlap, if at all, and how reading communities approach a work from radically different times and contexts. So let's model just one arrangement of this matrix, the modern Yiddish writer. One can see the modern Yiddish writer as first participating in the creation of a Yiddish collective readership. After all, he writes in Yiddish, or he or she writes in Yiddish for a Yiddish reader. But with the very adoption of the idea of modern literature, this writer also acknowledges the desire to reach toward other national and global audiences that also name themselves as modern, or even sometimes to some universal audience of some ultimate literary value. That is, to write in the modern is always already to be writing in translation, in global relation. So writing toward multiple communities implies certain compromises, approximations, shortcuts, creative misreadings that try to ensure the legibility of the Yiddish text in transcultural encounters. So seen from the vantage point of world literature, the enterprise of modern Yiddish writing appears to have an impossible trajectory. The writer is aligned in some way with a secular Western world, with all of its hidden Christian sacralizations, universalist ambitions, internal fractures. And at the same time, the Yiddish writer wants to create a separate Yiddish literary imaginary with all of its own internal messianic and political longings. So my research takes on the task of examining this very impossibility, exploring how modern Jewish writers conceive of the world and their place as Jews in its complex of audiences, networks, institutions. So something like the anthologies and canons of world literature, international modernism, global literary markets. Now, today I'm going to talk about some of the ways Yiddish writers fit or maybe don't fit into these various worlds. First, a few words about Yiddish and its fraught relationship with modernity. Jewish Enlightenment thinkers and cultural activists of the 19th century, of course, idealized the European. Real cultural achievement and Jewish integration would take place in their eyes through learning German or Russian, and thereby participating in these dominant cultures. But what could they do? The masses, unfortunately, didn't know these languages. So in order to educate them, to bring them up from their backward shtetl lives, these very gracious intellectuals took it upon themselves to descend to their level. Modern Yiddish literature begins from the idea that Yiddish could be used as a cultural tool only as long as it was needed. So many believe that once the people had been sufficiently modernized, they would magically move over to German and Russian, and Yiddish would naturally, right, very much using this natural metaphor, naturally disappear. So the very instantiation of Yiddish as a language of modernity took place under the marker of its own erasure. But at the same time, with the dispersion of Eastern European Jewish population and with the rise of Jewish nationalism, Yiddish also became the language of a global transnational community, and a vibrant one at that. The language that was supposed to disappear began also to have certain national and global ambitions. It had both its own transnational market, from Warsaw to Moscow to Buenos Aires to New York and beyond, even here in Boston, while also beginning to enter European and American markets through translation. Even as it faced the constant threat of erasure, so I'm thinking here also of acculturation, migration, economic decline, and then war and persecution, despite these threats, much of Yiddish literature imagined a utopian horizon. So let's take as our first example the writer Sholem Asch. Who is Sholem Asch? If you had asked such a question in the 1930s, you would have been laughed at. not just by Yiddish speakers. Right? By 1930s, Ash was well read across the globe by Yiddish readers in that transnational Yiddish network that I just mentioned, by non-Jewish English speakers in the US and in England, by German, Russian, and French intellectuals who had become some of his best friends and warmest supporters. Who is Shalom Ash? Why, he's one of the most important Jewish literary figures the world over. He's a celebrity. His 50th birthday in 1930 was celebrated in multiple cities, in multiple languages, and in pages of countless literary journals and newspapers. Yiddish critics hailed him as the master of Yiddish storytelling, a chronicler of a rapidly disappearing past. German critics called him the great Jewish epiker, an epic poet of the human condition. And the New York Times, after he'd become a bestseller, had Ash pegged as, quote, a genuinely significant novelist for the whole world, a magnificent storyteller, a vivid and large-scale historian. So in the 1930s, Ash was the Yiddish world writer, a writer who found his literary inspiration in small-town Eastern Europe, yet whose ambition was to be of the largest global recognition possible. So in 1933, he was all but convinced that he would get the Nobel Prize, that it was due to him in some way, like some other Jewish writers we know today. That he never received the Nobel Prize was one of the greatest disappointments of his career. So how did Ash earn this reputation? Ash was a jet setter in the 1930s. He was a fundraiser and spokesman for the Joint Distribution Committee. He made trips across all of Europe and North Africa. He made stops in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and New York to socialize with intellectual elites. He traveled to Warsaw and small towns surrounding it to refresh his connection to his Eastern European past. And finally, he returned after each trip to his villa, called Villa Sholem, conveniently placed in the resort town of Nice in France, where he took breaks from his feverish writing, because he wrote so much, to walk along the promenade. I just want to, this is a picture from later. It's an amazing picture I found in the archive of him on a boat at Camp Tanneman. But here's a picture of him in Nice in the 1930s, living the good life. Okay, but more important than his global wanderlust was his utopian vision for literature. What we today might call it a little bit naive, but then it was really the center of his literary project. So we'll take, for instance, his 1933 novel, Der Tehillim Yid, which translates literally as the Psalms Jew. The novel follows a young boy from a small town in Eastern Europe. Begins as an out-of-line, rambunctious child, much too much interested in the body and in non-Jews, God forbid. And then he slowly grows into a Hasidic miracle worker, a Rebbe with the special ability to intervene in the upper spheres. So his education is hardly a traditional one. He spends years in the Polish countryside. He defies any convention of traditional Jewish life. He even performs miracles, one of which costs him the life of his wife and child. But the novel culminates very dramatically in the encounter between the Rebbe and a local priest over the soul of a young woman, young Jewish woman who has fallen in love with a non-Jewish Polish youth. On the eve of her planned conversion to Christianity and to her marriage to the non-Jew, the two spiritual forces, the Rebbe on the one side, the priest on the other, both pray and fight over her soul through prayer. They both quote from the same verses of the Psalms in their spiritual battle, but the young woman, unable to decide between the two spiritual forces, ends up jumping from a window to her death. The tragic outcome greatly pains the Rebbe, and a short time later on his deathbed, he makes this pronouncement. Many ways lead to God, but the shortest and nearest way lies through his children. For one cannot gain access to the king, one tries to win the ear of the king's son. And God's majesty dwells in all mankind, and every man who seeks him. Therefore you must be careful to respect mankind. Every man who seeks God should be your brother. According to the words of the holy Rebbe Meir, a non-Jew who devotes his life to seeking God should be revered as if he were a high priest. Ash proposes here a delicate reconciliation between two formidable spiritual powers. though Asch was often accused of ecumenicalism. This compromise or mutual recognition is not about absolving the Christian characters of their historical violence. Rather, Asch demands a reorientation of what he might call Jewish wisdom. Asch attempts to create in Der Tehillim Yid a new model for thinking through Jewishness not as a persecuted minority, but rather a religious tradition that exists at the very foundation of the West. The name of the novel, Der Tehillim Yid, the Psalms Jew, points the reader's attention to the textual source, the Psalms that are purportedly shared by both religious traditions. The Rebbe is not simply a saint for the Jewish people, but one ready to speak on behalf of the entire Western tradition, if not the entire world. These are the stakes that we're talking about here. So the novel begins and ends deeply embedded in the shtetl. But Asch wants to imagine that this is where the world's redemption actually begins. He believed that the Yiddish novel, participating in the institutions and markets of world literature, could help bring about a redemption, both political and spiritual. The worldly Rebbe can potentially emerge out of the ghetto, or out of Nice, if need be, and into the global arena. So you can see how this kind of utopian thinking was reinforced in the act of translation. Here is a cover, I have it here too, of the English translation, which became a bestseller, completed just a year after the Yiddish novel was printed. And the title of the book was no longer The Psalms Jew, but now Salvation. And when I would read the novel on the subway in New York just a couple of years ago, I often suspected that fellow travelers on the subway didn't think I was reading a Yiddish novel, rather reading some evangelical, Christian evangelical literature, right? Salvation in big, gold letters. Asch's commitment to reconciliation, articulated during the rise of violent nationalism throughout Europe and during the precipitous decline of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, was certainly out of touch with Jewish and specifically Yiddish attitudes of the period. Asch's optimism seems entirely misplaced, but this was the goal he set for Yiddish literature as an integral part of world literature, the salvation of the world, right? Asch felt that as a novelist, as a literary celebrity, inside and outside Yiddish, he could intervene in world politics. In many ways, Asch saw himself as that worldly saint, a Jewish tzaddik who could participate in the world's redemption. So such an approach has its risks, of course, including the very erasure of Yiddish. So if we look at this cover page, the translators are mentioned, and these are Kafka's translators as well, right? But there is no mention of the original language, which of course Willa and Edwin Muir didn't know. They only knew German. They were translating from the German translation into English. And this omission of Yiddish recurred frequently in the translation of Asch's works, a fact that many Yiddish critics noticed with a bit more than just dismay. But Asch would dismiss these objections by explaining that it was well known that he was a Yiddish writer and that readers did not need explicit notification of this fact. But if, as Asch claimed, Jewishness was at the center of the Western tradition, why did its own language need to be hidden or obscured? This contradiction and others like it didn't seem to bother Asch. In keeping with his idealism, Asch's faith in an all-encompassing Judeo-Christian civilization did not depend on an incidental choice of language or geography. And in fact, Asch relied on his own celebrity as a way to confirm his universalist views. The very status of Yiddish depended then on his reputation. His name, Sholem Asch, couldn't be translated and could serve itself as a marker in and of itself of Yiddish and Yiddish civilization. Now, this investment in the importance of celebrity in the global literary market was a risk that now in hindsight may have appeared to be misguided, right? After all, Asch is almost entirely forgotten by contemporary readers. But Asch optimistically showed deep faith in the translatability of Jewish and Christian vocabularies. Asch believed in a kind of monolingualism that today we associate with the dangerous homogeneity of globalization. He participates in the essentialization and sometimes bland universalization of Jewishness. But at the same time, Asch remains an important model, whether cautionary or exemplary, for understanding the very ambitions of world literature. Now, Asch represents only one model of how Yiddish writing converges with concepts of the world and world literature, and despite his popularity in the Yiddish press and in world markets, Asch was harshly criticized, as I've already mentioned, especially by modernist writers in the US. I'm going to talk about one particularly grumpy critic. I hope his glasses don't make him look more grumpy than he actually was, named Yankov Glatstein. Glatstein was certainly no bestseller. He is hardly translated, does not appear in many anthologies. He did not expect to win a Nobel Prize. If anything, he discouraged translation, so much so that in 1939 he writes this very famous poem entitled Good Night World, in which he appeared to turn his back on all of modernity. At first glance, it would seem that Glatstein is a very poor choice for a model of Yiddish world literature. But if we're interested in thinking about something called a world literature to come, Glatstein could be a particularly useful model. So, the model of translation that Asch presented was particularly vexing to Glatstein. And he was vocal in condemning the ways in which he felt Jewish writers capitulated to external demands with little thought to the aesthetic or political consequences. One essay of Glatstein's that stands out by its title alone is his 1935 essay, The March to the Goyim. It's an acerbic account of the growing number of writers who look to publish in English rather than in Yiddish. He described this new trend as an epidemic. Writers were panicking, trying to save themselves from their Jewishness, Raten sich von Jiddischkeit. For Glatstein, the escape to translation was a medical disaster, because these writers had deemed Yiddish to be a kind of handicap or defect. They imagined that translation into English could be a kind of cure. Glatstein thought that the attraction to cheap translation was, in fact, the real malady. In declaring Yiddish a diseased body, these writers had caught, for Glatstein, a parallel disease, the affliction of terrible translation. The best-selling Asch, of course, received the brunt of these criticisms. He claimed that Asch limited the vocabulary of his writing in Yiddish to make the subsequent translation into English or German much easier. Glatstein blasted him for stooping to this lifeless Esperanto for the sake of money or fame, producing work that was at best sentimentalized or nostalgic portrayals of Jewish life for acculturated Jewish readers, or at worst, dishonest and rootless writing. Pretty brutal stuff. And taking this argument to its extreme, and we'll see a little bit of it in a bit, Glatstein believed that such bland universalism would actually lead to fascism. Indeed, he claims that the cure these writers had devised for their Jewishness would lead to more destruction and decay. The World Republic of Letters, as world literature is often called, was no republic at all, but a dictatorship of poor literary taste. And yet, despite this harsh critique, Glatstein still imagined, paradoxically, that Yiddish literature could somehow participate in world literature. Glatstein suggested an alternative conception of world writing, one that begins with a focus on a kind of national art that isn't the same as fascist art. So I'm going to read this long passage just to show you some of the wit involved here. There is, however, a second system. There are those writers who chew themselves directly into the language in which they write. Such a writer is often harder to translate. He is too enmeshed in his own words. You need strange instruments to tear him out of his language. And you're left not with a translation, but with a kind of obstetrics. He must be torn from his mother's stomach. If you will, this second kind of art is national art. If you will, it is Proust, Joyce, Pushkin, Gogol, Shalom Aleichem, Bialik. The world has perhaps heard their names for some reason or another, but they have no great luck in the world because, as great writers, they have sought their freedom in the narrowest discipline of their own language, measuring out words like pharmacists, working within the possibilities or limits of their own tongue. And what difference does it make if Pushkin, Bialik, or Joyce cannot be easily transposed into foreign languages, where it is impossible to capture the evaporating original scent of each word? Who cares if a great Albanian or a great Romanian poet remains unknown in Alaska? After all, what meaning can one claim for international ideals transmitted through literature in the light of a world literature that kept refining itself more and more until it produced Hitlerism and Mussolinianism? Gladstein's idea of world literature seems to follow a dialectic, universal value through the national. It is the writer who consumes his own language, who buries himself in the womb of his mother tongue, who is able to achieve greatness. This is not the violent and expansionist nationalism of fascism, but rather a devotion to the particular, the way a word has meaning only through the lens of a specific community's histories, triumphs, and catastrophes. Gladstein fetishizes certainly the original scent of a language, its authenticity and its untranslatability. Gladstein continues the medical metaphor, right? But instead of using the threat of a foreign disease, he focuses on the possibility of birth. Gladstein attempts to explain how Yiddish might escape the walls of the womb and be born into the world without producing a deformed universalism. Gladstein's argument is that only an eminently particularist writer is worth anything on the world stage. He surprisingly dismisses the global reputations of Proust, Joyce, Gogol, and Pushkin as if they were somehow obscure figures, right? The world has perhaps heard their names, very dangerous perhaps there. Gladstein was surely aware that while these authors may not have appeared on bestseller lists, though Joyce did appear on the bestseller list, they were still some of the most important writers for an international network of modernists. Gladstein does not hesitate to place Shalom Aleichem and Bialik in the same breath as these writers, implying that the right kind of obstetrics would show that Shalom Aleichem in Yiddish and Bialik in Hebrew had excavated their own languages in such a way that their work could speak authoritatively to global audiences about Jewishness. Gladstein claims that the way to reach the world was not through the derivative act of the bestseller. Rather, one joined the world through becoming part of a literary network that shared some traditions and genres, certainly, but also some paradoxical worldview of particularism. The question that begs then is how a Jewish writer can become part of a world literary republic if they're not willing to make the compromises that Asch accepted. What could be the right kind of obstetrics that would give birth to the perfect translation and allow the Jewish writer to emerge on the global stage? We only have Gladstein's parodic commentary on this problem for any kind of answer. I imagine a great Yiddish writer somewhere in Minsk, Pinsk, Lodz, Lublin, or Chelm, and a great world sage and world translator in the middle of the crater of the Popocatépetl. Between the two, there would be no contact except for heart vibrations. And suddenly the world translator would knock on the low door of the lonely writer, bow his Gentile, over 6 feet tall figure, take off his top hat, and fall to his feet. O greatest of great Israelite authors, the world awaits your Yiddish word. With tears of joy, the writer would fall into the arms of the world translator, and they'd both sing, Oid loy ovdo tikvoseinu. Our hope has not yet been lost. So Gladstein here imagines a utopian scenario in which the Yiddish writer doesn't have to seek out a translator and grovel before him. Instead, the translator makes pilgrimage to the Yiddish writer, as if to a hidden saint. The impossible distance between the Jew and the non-Jew is bridged mystically and comically by heart vibrations. There is no intermediating universal or global language to bring them together, nor do they meet in one of the centers of international literary market like New York, Paris, or Moscow. Rather, the translator leaves his own exotic home on the periphery, a volcano in Mexico. There's the Popocatépetl for you. And travels to another periphery, the Jewish cities of Eastern Europe, and even the parodic shtetl of Chelm. The result of their meeting is hardly a translation at all, but instead a celebration of Jewish languages. The translator proclaims that the world awaits a Yiddish word, not a Yiddish word in translation. And then they sing the Atikva together, which by 1936 already was the Zionist national anthem and also a poem that evokes an idea of Jewish messianism, of course. The arrival of Yiddish on the world stage will be the result of a 2,000-year-old hope. Gladstein's world literature is a kind of messianic waiting game, in which the very untranslatability of a text determines its place on the world stage. He rejects conventional translation. Instead, when translation remains an impossible problem, rather than a constitutive element in the writing and reading of a text, then one is closer to a truly valuable and worldly literary object. As a result, for Gladstein, world literature as a concept is something that is perpetually deferred. It's not something that can be managed through the flattening and equalizing act of translation. The world just doesn't seem ready yet to accept Yiddish on its own terms. Rather than clamor for more translation, Gladstein advocates patience, saying, "The time is not yet right for forcing on the world a great Jewish writer who writes in Yiddish. One thing is clear to me. The world will not be taken by force. The Jewish world writer will actually arrive unexpectedly from those Yiddish-writing cadres that have toiled and labored entirely for Yiddish literature without any other expectations." So in the face of Asch's best-selling model, in the face of concerns that haunted many Jews of the 1930s, Gladstein felt he could not abandon the linguistic boundaries of Yiddish literature. Abandonment of the particular to grovel before the translator for Gladstein meant the sacrifice of the only home he had ever known, the Yiddish language. That space could be given over to the world only through a messianic intervention that would still somehow preserve a good Yiddish word. Gladstein wanted to be part of world literature, certainly, but he wanted to be accepted on his terms and literally in his own language. Gladstein waited for a kind of translation that would reaffirm the Yiddishness of the work and not allow the original personal language to be erased. Now, it's tempting, and many have done this, to interpret Gladstein's bitter tone in these essays as an expression of jealousy for Asch's success. And certainly, Gladstein couldn't avoid being a kind of reactionary. And he never tired of exclaiming why the importance of remaining in the margins. But I don't think Gladstein really can be limited to being a marginalized or conservative writer, or even a nationalist one. After all, the national system that he proposes here is surprisingly international. Right? Eastern Europe, through the centers of Western Europe, from the streets of New York to a volcano in Mexico. Right? Gladstein wants to imagine a form of world literature that escapes the constraints of the nation, while constructing a literary network beyond the equally limiting confines of the market, the anthology or the bestseller list. Gladstein presents a model whose value lies in his conscious insistence on the impossibilities that circumscribe the literary act, underscoring the limitations of literature's empires and its ghettos. A deferred world literature, a world literature to come, an oilem habe, offers a critique of Asch's dependence on monolingualism and universalism, yet still acknowledges the global context of any writing within and toward modernity. Buried in Yiddish and refusing to see literature as a form of ideological redemption, Gladstein focuses his attention on potentiality. Now, this makes for a compelling, if not equally problematic, model for world literature, a world composed of impossible, untranslatable works. So, today we've looked at two models of how Yiddish is implicated within concepts of world literature. Asch embraces the redemptive possibilities of the global literary network, believes wholeheartedly in translation, identifies with the figure of the worldly Jewish saint come to save the world, and yet his writing is forgotten, his literary activism appearing as naive and out of date. In contrast, Gladstein rejects any universal horizon for literature, embraces untranslatability, and enacts a kind of closing of the ranks for the sake of some messianic waiting game of world literature to come. And he, too, is a figure of little anthological or canonical consequence outside the Yiddish world. So why then am I even here? Why did I bring these two figures to you today? If their work doesn't circulate in international networks of world literature, what's even going on here? So what I think is so compelling about these two writers is they present world literature as a contingent category. So not a marker of universal value, not a way to make distinctions in various lists of who's better or who's worse as a writer, who deserves to live on for perpetuity or not, Rather, it makes world literature into an impossible thing, an institution haunted by a kind of undecidability. Yiddish literature, as a literature implicated in world literature, circulates widely within its own oilem, but also in contact with other networks and publics, through translation, or even just through the very mark of modernity. The text emerges as part of a collective Jewish discourse, and then immediately escapes into other conjoined and sometimes incommensurable networks and systems. In this sense, world literature is that which cannot be contained within any institutional grouping, but instead constantly moves, translatable and untranslatable, of both the olam and the oilem. Thank you very much.